Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Live. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk, and on the keyboard I have my buddy Angelo hoping to answer questions. Today I'm going to be talking about pattern on a path, and here's a prime example of where you might want to do something like that. Here's another example. I did this about 5 years ago. This is a lacrosse head. And you can see all the holes kind of following this, free-form organic type shape. This is where the netting would get threaded or tied in or whatever. So I'm going to be going through and showing some tips and tricks on how you can use pattern on a path. Now, I'm not going to be able to do the whole brush today. I'm going to focus mainly on the head, but just taking a look at the handle right now. Pretty simple shape, kind of an elliptical shape. You can tell I used a free form to connect to that. And I'm actually basing this off of my wife's hairbrush. Hopefully she's not missing it right now and comes looking for it. But anyways, let's dive right in. So I'm going to start by creating this curved surface. It's a little hard to see because of the black or whatever, but I'm going to start by creating this curved surface. And then we're going to use that curved surface to help us define the direction of these pins. I'm going to call them pins. And you can see how they're, perpendicular to that surface. And that's kind of the cool thing with today's project. Okay, so some of this is going to be similar, some of it's going to be new, but I'm going to start out by creating a sketch. And I'm going to start with an elliptical shape. Now, I don't use ellipse all that often, but in this case, the shape of the brush is an ellipse. So I'm going to start with the ellipse command, and it says place the center point. So I'm going to start here, and then it's asking for either the width or the height. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do the height, and according to my measurements, it's 4 1/4 tall. Then I'm going to hit the tab key, and you'll notice even though my cursor is way above this, it's basically asking for the angle of this ellipse. So I'm going to just click up here so it's vertical. And now as I move my cursor to the right, you can see there's the overall length of it. And now I can say it's 2.5 inches wide. Okay. So let me just move a couple of these dimensions so you can kind of see what's going on here. So I created an ellipse, 4 1/4 tall, 2.5 wide. Now, with this project, we're basically going to be working in one quadrant and then mirroring a couple times. So I'm only going to work in one quadrant. Well, you'll notice that this is all one spline, or in this case, an ellipse. So I'm going to create some geometry that's going to help me split this apart. And you've seen me do this before. I purposely over-exaggerate. Instead of trying to draw a horizontal and a vertical line, I'm just going to do something like this, okay? That way, when I come in and constrain it, I can visually confirm that everything's correct. So, for example, I want that line to be coincident with my center point, and I can visually see that it jumped to the center point. Same thing from there to there. I can see that it's now going through that, I shouldn't say center point, I should say origin point. Then I'll come in here and say horizontal, vertical. I'll click on that line and I can visually see that it's now vertical. Click on that line, I can visually see that that's horizontal. You don't have to do it that way, but to me it's confirmation that it was done correctly. I can also see, if I expand up my sketches, you can kind of see that these lines are black. And that means that they're constrained to the origin, for example. So I'm going to change these to construction geometry. Let me just go ahead and make sure I get that line there. So now you can see that those are construction geometry. Okay. So like I said, I need to split this, or we use the term break. I need to break this into quadrants. So under the modify command, there's a command called break. Now trim physically removes geometry. So if I came in here and said trim, it's going to physically remove that section. What break does is it just basically breaks it. And you'll see, it's kind of hard to see, but as I hover over, you're going to see a little red X up here, and you're going to see a little red X over here. So I'm clicking on this segment, and notice it warned me that by doing that, we're going to lose some of our constraints, but that's okay. But now you can see that this is its own segment. If I come over here, you can see that it's 3/4 of a segment. And what this did when I said break, it went to the next intersection basically, which is right here, and it broke it at that intersection, and it broke it at this intersection. So same thing right here. I'm just going to hover over this line. You can see the red X appearing in this area here. So I'll click, and I now have 2 segments. So we're basically breaking it. You'll notice it's still a valid profile. I'm not trimming anything away. So I'll go ahead and break that segment there. I don't need to break this one because by breaking it here and by breaking this one up here, it became its own segment. Okay, so that was the break command. Okay, so I now have the overall shape of basically the head of the brush. Now I want to kind of create the curvature. And to do this, I'm going to use surfacing. But I want to create some geometry that's going to help me create a nice surface. So I'm going to continue drawing some geometry here. So I'm going to say, let's create a sketch on this front face. Okay, now here is where 3D Sketch really helps out. And let me show you why. I want to create a spline. So I'm going to go spline, and you'll notice that it's not snapping or catching to this profile because I haven't projected anything. There's nothing on this sketch. You'll notice if I turn off my original sketch, there's nothing there. So that's why it's not catching to it. However, if I turn on 3D Sketch, it doesn't instantly put me into 3D Sketch. So here's one of my tips. I turn it on, I'm going to say Finish Sketch. Then I'm going to edit that sketch again, and you'll notice it's turned on. And now when I do the spline, you see this triad icon that appears, and that's a visual confirmation that I'm in my 3D sketch. But check this out. Now notice it's actually snapping to this spline. Okay, I didn't have to project anything or anything like that, but 3D Sketch has some smartness built into it. So I'm going to get near this point, and you can see it turn to a square. So I know I'm at that end point right there. So I'm going to click there. Okay, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about 3D sketching, but you'll see that this plane is black. I'm sorry, blue. So it's going to basically be drawing in that plane, in that direction. So if I were to click up here, it's going to basically be in line with this. It's not going to go way back here in space somewhere. So I'm just going to click somewhere up here. I don't really care right now where. And then I'm going to come over here, and again, you can kind of see it snapping to that edge, but I'm going to make sure I see that little square, and I'm going to go ahead and click there. Okay, and I'm going to say that I'm done. So what did it do? Well, it created a flat spline. I'm kind of looking down at the top of it on that plane, exactly from the edge there, exactly to the edge over there. Now I want to make sure that this point is straight up and down, so I'm going to use the line command. I'm just going to go from that point there to that point there. Okay. Done. Then I'll constrain this. I'll say I want that to be horizontal vertical, and watch what it does. See how it kind of moved over and that line is now vertical. Now this is a pretty steep curvature to the surface, so I'm going to throw a dimension on here. Again, this is all just taking measurements off of the existing brush that I had, so this is supposed to be 0.35, and watch what happens to my spline. So you'll see it still is touching those corners, but it's now kind of more of a slightly crowned curve. okay? Now these green handles here, they allow me to change the tangency direction and the tangency weight. So you can kind of see how this one kind of slopes gradual to that point, but this one kind of comes across and then steeply goes down. So you can control the weight, which is like how strong is this tangency condition, and then you can also control the direction of that tangency. And believe it or not, you can actually dimension, you know, for example, from this edge here to this edge here, and you could say, I want that to be 45 degrees if you wanted to. In this case, I'm not going to. I'm going to leave everything kind of just default right out of the way it was. Let me make sure, undo. Yep, okay. So I also want to split this spline, because you'll notice it goes all the way across. And like I mentioned, we're only going to be working in quadrants. So I'm going to, I should quit using the term split. I'm going to say break. I hover over this line, and again, you can see that little red X appear. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And I've now broken this spline into 2 segments. Okay. So that's going to kind of define the curvature in one direction. I also want to define the curvature in this length direction. So pretty much the same thing. I'm going to create a sketch on this front face. I'm in my 3D sketch. So what I can do is come over here and you'll see it turn to like a square. So I'm going to go ahead and click there. Now I do want to make sure that I catch to this point right here. So I'm not going to randomly go somewhere else. I'm going to go there and click. So my spline is going to go through that point. And then once again, I'll come over here, wait until it turns to a square, and say OK. Okay. Now, I need to break this spline. So I'm going to come in here and say break. But watch what happens when I hover over this line. I do not see the red X. Okay? So I'm going to do something a little bit fun here. Pop quiz. If you think you know why, throw it in the chat real quick. You don't have to be lengthy. Just why do you think the red X is not appearing when I'm doing this break? So I'm going to pause for about 10 seconds here. Let you guys throw your answers out there. So does anybody know why it's not letting me break this? So we'll give you guys a few seconds to answer that. So Al said no point at the top. Okay. Joel said there's no intersection. Fred said it's a bug. Nope, it's not a bug. I can prove that. So Joseph said, I always make the mistake of clicking and not escaping after the spline. Angelo says he knows why. Chris, I'm going to give you the gold star for the day. He said vertical line is in a different plane. Somebody else said because it's in the other sketch. You guys are too smart. You shouldn't be watching my live streams. You know all this. So that is exactly correct. Let me show you what's happening here. So I'm trying to break this line, and I see this line right here, okay? However, that's on a totally different sketch. In fact, if I turn those 2 sketches off, you'll notice that there is no line right there for it to use to break. So yes, you guys are absolutely correct. There was no intersection point. There was nothing for it to stop at, because break basically goes to the next boundary, and there wasn't one because it was on a totally different sketch. So the next boundary is way over here. So there was nothing to break. So yes, you guys are awesome. So how could I do this? Well, let's just go ahead and project onto this sketch that line. So we're basically projecting this line from sketch 2 onto sketch 3. So watch, I'm going to go ahead and click this guy. I'm just doing the selected entities. I'll say OK. And now if I turn off those 2 sketches, I now have a line or a boundary. Okay, so let's see what happens if I try the break command. So I like James, he said it was a human bug. Yep, it was my fault because I hadn't projected it. So human bug. So now notice I'm hovering over this section and there is that little red X right there. So I'm able to break this into a separate segment. Now, why am I really highlighting this? This happens to me a lot. And I also take quite a few calls from customers where they're like, I go to extrude and half of my geometry isn't a valid profile. Well, it's because it's actually on a different sketch and they didn't realize that they had created a third sketch or something like that. And when they go to extrude, sketch number 2 and sketch number 1 aren't active and they're not being extruded. So I kind of highlighted this because I run into this a lot also. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish the sketch there. So what have we done here? We've basically, you can kind of see we've started to create what almost kind of looks like a surface so far. You know, these are the wires, like if you were making this out of fabric or something like that, and these were just thin pieces of metal, you could lay a piece of fabric over this and it would create a nice looking surface. Okay, so I'm going to switch into the surface tools. Now, I'm going to show a couple tips. This is actually, some of these tips are from one of my coworkers who's really good with surfacing. I'm not much of a surfacing person, so I'm going to pass on these tips and kind of show you why, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because mine's more about pattern on a path than it is about creating surfaces. But let me show you an example here. So I'm going to come in here and say create a patch. Okay, it basically allows me to specify a boundary and it's going to fill in. So watch, I'm going to say patch. And then notice because we've split this, I can click here, I can click there, and I can click here, and I get a surface. It's like a piece of paper or piece of fabric that is being created by those 3 lines. Okay, I could even specify an interior rail if I wanted to, but the key thing I wanted to point out here is notice it says curve 1, 2, and 3, but there's no options here. Okay, it's literally just filling that area in with some with a surface, with some material or whatever. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm going to cancel out. So here's the trick that he showed me, which I think is pretty cool because it gives you more options. It takes more steps, but it gives you more options. I'm going to come in here and say extrude. Okay. Now, watch what happens when I hover over this edge. It highlights the whole edge. And you're probably saying, well, didn't we just spend 15 minutes splitting those edges or whatever? Well, it's because this chaining is turned on. So I'm going to turn chaining off. And now you'll see it's its own edge. I'm going to grab that edge and just drag it some random distance. It does not matter how far. I'm just going to extrude that edge back. Okay. Now if I expand open my bodies, you'll see there's a little surface right there. I'm going to continue doing that with these 3 quadrants, these 3 edges. So I'm going to extrude an edge back that way. And then I'll also turn off my chaining, extrude this edge down. Okay, so what did we do here? Well, we basically, again, created some kind of a boundary, but now there's surfaces that are going to be touching that. So watch, I'm going to do the exact same command. I'll come in here and say patch. Okay, what are my boundary edges? So I'm going to say that edge there, and this edge here. Now, notice they're labeled. Even though I clicked this one last, it says this is edge 1, edge 2, and edge 3. And it looks pretty similar to what I created earlier, okay? But notice the options that I have, okay? So edge 1, I don't want to mess with. In fact, I'm going to purposely mess with it to show you what these options are. It says connected, so there's G0 continuity. It basically means this surface is touching or connected to this surface, okay? Well, if I came in and said, you know what, I want to make that tangent, look what it does. In fact, I'm going to kind of rotate to the side. You can kind of see it's really having to modify the shape of this, but it's basically taking that surface and making it tangent to edge 1. So it gives you a lot more power. So for example, I could say I want edge 2 to be tangent, and you can't really see much happening, but what it's going to do is it's going to smooth this out and end up, being tangent with that surface. Whereas when we just did the 3 edges by itself, there was no tangency control or connected control or curvature or anything like that. And you can see you actually can change the weight of this if you want to. So I could come here and make both of these surfaces tangent, and it's going to create a much nicer looking surface for us. Okay. Now in this example, I'm just going to leave everything connected. I don't want to worry about tangencies or anything like that right now, and you'll see why here in a little bit. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that because Jeff Smith, who's on our team, he showed me this, and I thought it was a really cool tip. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say okay, and now you'll notice I have all 4 of these bodies. Well, I'm going to turn off the ones I don't need. Okay, and so I'm left with this one little patch, basically. Okay, well, because everything's kind of symmetric, I could come in here and say mirror. What do I want to mirror? I want to mirror that body. What's my mirror plane? Well, because I created everything at 0, 0, I can select this vertical plane right here, and you'll see it's going to mirror along that plane. But watch what happens over here when I say okay. It is now 2 separate bodies. I want to stitch these together. And another tip that Jeff gave me was stitch as you go. So instead of doing all 4 of these and then stitching them, he recommends stitching as you go. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want to stitch that surface to this surface. We're basically sewing it together. And you notice how the edge turns green. It obviously can't stitch these outside surfaces. There's nothing for it to stitch to. So I'm going to stitch that together, and you'll notice we're back to 1 body. Okay? Then I'll go ahead and mirror this one more time. Notice it's 1 body. What's my mirror plane? That guy there. I'll say okay. We'll stitch that one to that one. You can see the green line, which is good. And we are back to 1 surface body. Okay? Now, I told you earlier, I don't care too much about like the tangency conditions or anything like that, because we're basically doing plane along a path. If I were building this as an actual surface or whatever, I would probably spend more time with the tangencies. I might control, the angle that, this slope comes into this edge, etc. But that could take a whole session just on surfacing, so I'm keeping this fairly simple. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, now I kind of have the basic shape to put all of my little pins. I need to create some paths for those pins to follow. So I'm going to do an offset plane. So I'm going to offset this horizontal plane, which is way down here. And I'm just going to bring it up some distance. It doesn't matter. I'm just making it above my object. And then I'm going to create a sketch on that plane. Now you'll notice my screen did not go orthographic like it usually does. And that's because I'm still in my 3D sketch. And I'm actually done with what I need 3D sketching for, so I'm going to turn that off. But you'll notice like nothing really happens, so I'm going to say finish sketch. I'll come back into that sketch, and now you'll notice it's orthographic. It's not going to have that triad anymore that gets in the way or whatever that you usually see with 3D sketch. Okay? Okay, so I want to create some equally spaced elliptical paths for these pins to follow. So I'm going to project, so P for project, and you'll notice right now it's on specified entities. So I could project each quadrant, or I could pick this edge, for example, and then this edge, and then this edge, but that would take some time. Or I could say bodies and watch what happens. It's going to basically do like a silhouette of the whole body. So when I click on that and say OK, it projected all of those edges for me in one click, basically, instead of having to me do it manually, click after click after click. So that was this bodies option in project. By default, it's usually set to the specified entities. Okay, cool. So now I have this shape. I'm going to use the offset command in Fusion. What is the sketch curves? And notice it's all one curve. And I want it to go in 0.25, let's just say 1/4 of an inch. And you can see that sure enough, it offset that ellipse in 1/4 of an inch. Well, you can't use pattern to do this, and I'm going to use offset again. And you'll notice if I try and offset this line, it says one or more of the curves has already been offset. Consider offsetting the original profile again. So this is something with Fusion. You can only offset the original. You can't offset an offset or offset, two offsets or whatever. So I'm going to offset this guy, and I'll say, let's go 0.5. And you can see I get that result. I'll click on here again and say, let's go 0.75. And you're starting to notice, because of how we're offsetting, that our ellipse is not as round down here anymore, but that's exactly how it is on the, let me show here. You can kind of see how they kind of come to points and stuff like that the closer we get into the inside. So it's actually doing it just like the actual product, which is kind of cool. So I'll come in here, let's do this one, I'll offset that one. And then there's a row that's just a single line basically right here. So I'm going to draw a line. Again, kind of some weird shape like so. I'll make it vertical. And I'm going to say I want the midpoint of that line to be at 0, 0. Okay, so now if I were to change the length of this line, you can see how it's constrained and it's equal and all that kind of stuff. So I just created a line, made it vertical, and then I made the midpoint be right there at the center. Okay, so if I rotate this now, you can see that we drew all of these on a flat plane above this surface. Okay, now there's a really cool command in project. So we usually use this project right here, but notice there's one in here called project to surface. Now I'm going to purposely make a mistake here because this happens a lot. You might get this error message, and I'm going to explain what it means. So I'm going to say project to surface. Okay, and it's asking what face. I'm going to go ahead and select one face. And then it's asking for a curve. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this curve. And then finally, notice here's the warning. No support for projecting sketch geometry into the same sketch. Please change the target sketch or geometry. And when I first saw this, I'm like, what does this mean? Well, basically what we're trying to do here is we're using this geometry and we're wanting to project it onto a surface here. Okay, so what it's saying is you can't project this onto the same sketch. So I'm going to say finish sketch. Then I'm going to create a new sketch, and it doesn't matter where. I'm going to, again, click on this bottom plane. It really doesn't matter in this case. Okay. Then I'm in my sketch. You'll notice I now have two sketches. Sketch 4, which is all of these little rings. Okay. And then sketch 5 is this new one. Now I'm going to say project to surface. Okay. By default, it's usually set to closest point. Now that works great if your stuff is planar, and what that basically means is it would take this curve and try and get it to the closest or the shortest distance to that surface. So that could be, it's hard to point out, could be in this direction here, it could be in this direction here, who knows. Well, I want to basically project this down, almost like we're wrapping it onto the surface. So I'm going to change my project type to a long vector. And this is going to allow me to specify which direction. So you'll notice it says project direction. And I can click on, let me zoom up here just a little bit, this vertical axis right here, this blue line. I'm going to click on there, and you can kind of see it gives me an arrow preview that the lines are going to project in this direction until they hit a surface. Okay? So what are my faces? I'm going to click these 4 faces. Okay? What are the curves? And check this out. I'm going to go ahead and click on that edge right there, and you can see that sure enough, it projected it straight down onto this curved surface. So I can go ahead and click around so you can kind of see I'll do that, and I now have a ring. Let me look at it from the top. You can kind of see it follows that path, but it's on the surface of this part right here. And you can kind of see how it changes as it goes around that surface just due to the length and width and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. I'm going to click around. And again, because these are split, that's why I'm having to do these in 4s basically, but I do need the full path. Okay. So I got that guy, so I need to do this guy, that guy, and this guy, and then finally that line through the center. And now you can kind of see the curvature of this. They all match looking down from the top. Pretty cool. Okay, so I use that along vector a lot. It's a pretty neat project to surface along vector. Okay, so a little confusing here, so I'm going to turn off Sketch 4, and you'll see that Sketch 5 is actually a 3-dimensional sketch, basically. It's a kind of a 3D sketch. Okay? Cool. So we now have the surface, we now have the paths that we want to use. What we need to do now is create the object that we're going to pattern on these paths. So I'm going to say finish sketch, and I'm going to switch back to my solid, and I'm going to just create a cylinder primitive because these pins are basically just a cylinder with a round head, and I'm going to show how I did that. Okay, so I'm going to create a cylinder. I could create a sketch, I could draw a circle, I could then go to extrude, but if I just go to cylinder, it's going to allow me to pick a sketch plane. Let's just do that guy there. I'm just going to draw it out here in space somewhere. Okay. Now these are pretty small. In fact, they're 0.066 in diameter. Okay. And then so you can see 0.066 in diameter, and they're 0.55 inches tall. And you'll notice it says new body. I'm going to go ahead and say okay. And I just quickly created a cylinder that's 0.066 in diameter and 0.55 tall. Now I want to put that bead or that ball on the top. So I'm going to zoom up on this guy, go to create, and I'm also going to create another primitive. I'm going to create a spherical primitive. Okay. It's going to ask, where do you want to create it? Well, notice I can click on this face. Okay. And then if I get near the center, again, it's kind of hard to see, but it kind of snaps to that little round icon right there. And by default, it wants to cut, okay? So you can kind of see that. But in this case, instead of cutting, I want to join. And it's going to basically add a sphere on here. In fact, let's make it, I think it's 0.1 in diameter. Let me zoom out just a little bit, and you kind of see I quickly was able to create that head on the pin. Okay, here's another tip. When you start patterning things, think ahead a little bit, especially if you want to apply materials. You'll want to do it to the main part, and then when you pattern that, they'll all be that same color. If you just pattern it right now and then you come back and say, okay, I want to make them blue, you have to physically click every single one, which takes some time. So I'm going to go into my appearance. So I think under modify appearance, I always use the A key, the shortcut key. So for example, I'm out here in space, I just hit A, and you can see it brings up my appearances. Okay, so here's my default appearances. I'm gonna just go into plastic. You can see all the different kinds of plastics we have in there. And I'm just gonna do a translucent plastic. Now I want these to be kind of a dark black, but I want them to be glossy. And you can see glossy blue, gray, green, red, etc., white, but you don't see a glossy black. So I'm just gonna drag this blue onto this body, and here's another tip that's coming up. I'm gonna drag it onto the body. So I'm gonna drag this over here, and you can see the whole thing, the whole body turned blue. I'm going to show you how we're going to just change the head of the pin here in just a minute. Okay, so let's right click and edit. And this will allow me to change the color. So you can kind of see I can just drag this guy around, and I'm going to bring it down to, you know, a fairly dark. It doesn't have to be perfectly black, but I might do like a grayish black, like so. And say done, and you'll see that the icon kind of changed to, even though it says blue, it's kind of a black color. Okay, well I want this to be a kind of a purple or magenta color, and again I don't see a purple or magenta in here. So I'm going to change this to faces, and I'm just going to drag red and drop it on that face, and you'll notice that it only applies the material to that face. Okay. If you forgot and did it to bodies, it would turn the whole thing red. Okay, so I'm going to right click and edit this guy, and I said I want it to be kind of a magenta color, so I'm going to drag this slider over here. I can, you know, change the color just by dragging this point over here. Here's another tip that not a lot of people know about, this color library right here. These are all your Pantone colors, so you could actually search for you know, for example, violet, and it's going to show all of the different, you know, colors that have violet in it. So I'm going to go ahead and say that guy there, and it will use that particular color for, you can kind of see it pick that one right there. So if I were to do, you know, violet quartz, for example, you can see how that's much darker. So, oops, didn't mean to duplicate it, sorry. Let me edit that. So again, that's the Pantone colors if you want to use those. So I'll use that one there, looks pretty good. And there's my single pin. In fact, I'm going to rename it to pin. Okay, hopefully this is going good for you guys. I can see Angelo's talking and answering questions. Okay, so now I need to line this pin to be perpendicular to this surface. And if I just came in here and said move, you know, from point to point, for example, so I'm gonna go, I'm purposely making a mistake. I'm gonna go from there to there. It moved it, but you'll notice it's not in the right direction, and I would have to rotate and figure that out. Well, of course, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to let Fusion do the hard work. So I need to somehow align this with, at a very particular point on this transitional surface here. So I'm going to build some axes, okay? And one of them is axis perpendicular to face. Okay, I want it to be perpendicular at a point. Okay, now you'll also notice it says axis perpendicular at point. I don't use this one as often because basically what it allows you to do is you can just click somewhere on that face, and that's where it's going to put that axis, and I didn't get to specify a very specific point. However, axis perpendicular to face, it says what is the face? So I'm going to go ahead and click on that face right there. Now it's asking what is the point? And I'm going to go ahead and click that point, and notice what it did. It created an axis that's perpendicular 90 degrees at that point. It's a really cool option. Now, also, new little tip, if you didn't know this, you can change the length of your axes just by grabbing the endpoints. And as I go through, you're going to notice that some of these axes get kind of weird. So I'm going to do that again. Axis perpendicular to face, add a point. I'm going to click on that guy there. And I'm just going to repeat this a couple times. At that point there, see, like what I was talking about, this one, for whatever reason, gets really long. I'll repeat just by clicking and dragging my right mouse click straight up. So that face, that point, and then finally that face at that point, and it put it underneath, it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to fix a couple of these. I'm going to drag that point up. I might drag these points down. They don't need to be that. I mean, you could leave them that way if you wanted to. To me, it makes it harder to fit your screen when there's extra geometry. And then same thing with this guy. Oops. I'm going to turn off the body to help me with this. I need to make sure I'm grabbing that point right there. Okay, so now I have these axes. Okay, we're going to use the align command. This is really powerful. So I'm going to say align. What do I want to align? I want to align this body. Now notice as I hover over it, it's almost like creating the joint, creating an assembly joint. You can kind of see these little tick marks. So I want to grab this bottom tick mark, okay, and I want to align it to this line, and watch what happens. So you can kind of see how it lined that up, and it's on that axis, perpendicular to the surface, but you'll notice it's not in the right location, okay? And you'll notice it doesn't let me, position it. It only aligns it, okay? So I'm going to come in here and say move. And I want to move this body. Now here's another tip. You'll notice as I hover over this sphere, my arrows kind of point randomly in different directions. But if I hover over the cylinder, you can still see that the arrows are kind of rotating around, but that Z direction arrow is always pointing up. And that's all I care about right now. So I'm just going to click there. And this is going to allow me to slide this pin up or down. Okay, to appease everybody, I could say go from point to point. So I'm going to go from that point there to that point there, and it's going to move that cylinder to that point, okay? And it's going to keep it in line. Or I could do it kind of how this thing is manufactured. I could just drag this down until it intersects, because it actually gets pushed down into the fabric. And I honestly don't really care how far. Okay, I just want it somehow intersecting this surface, because maybe when I join it later or something like that, I want that to make sure that it's going to join. If I just went to the point, it could leave a little gap underneath it that I have to figure out and fill in. So I'm just going to sink it down into this surface just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and say okay. Okay, so there we go. We got our first pin. Finally, we're going to get to the command that this live stream is all about, and that is pattern on a path. So I've shown rectangular patterns, I've shown circular patterns, but what is this pattern on a path? So I'm going to go ahead and select it. What do I want to pattern? I want to pattern this body, so I'm going to click on that body. Okay. Now it's asking for a path. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these 4 paths, like so. And you'll notice it says it's an invalid input setting. Well, that's because it's trying to pattern right on top of itself. I'm going to go ahead and start to drag this arrow, and you'll see it's giving me a live preview of what this is going to look like. And as I continue around, you can kind of see how it's patterning this along that path. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to come back here. You'll also notice this suppress, and each of these has a little checkbox. It's kind of hard to see. It's kind of buried inside the cylinder right there. But you could say, I want 100 of these, but turn off, you know, number 5, number 50, and number 99, for example. So you could suppress those if you want. To speed things up, I'm going to turn that off because I don't want to suppress any of these pins. And then it's asking for the quantity, okay? And yes, I counted the number of pins on my wife's hairbrush. So I'm going to type in 42 for this outside ring, and notice the preview that I get. So I'm going to go ahead and continue dragging along this path, and you're going to start to see that they start to spread out a little bit more. But you're going to also probably go, whoa, those look really weird. They're all leaning the same direction. And that is right here. This orientation is set to identical. So whatever angle this object is, it's going to keep that angle as it travels along that path. Okay? So I'm going to change it from identical to path direction, and notice what we get. It's basically almost like it created an axis at every single location, and these pins are now perpendicular on that path on that surface. I think this is wicked cool. Okay, now I can come in here and adjust the spacing or whatever. I can see we're pretty close to the distance of 9, so I'm going to just type in 9. So I'm basically telling it go, 9 inches along that line. I just kind of go visually what looks good. Okay, and I'll say okay. So actually, let me pause here. So we did quantity of 42. The start point, it's by default, it's going to start right there. But I could say, I want it to start over here and then start doing the pattern. But in this case, I want it basically to go 360. But that's what that is. I could also come in here and say, I want this to be equally spaced, a 1/4 inch apart or whatever. In this example, I have it set to extent, and that's why it's giving me the total distance, and it's not asking me for spacing or anything like that. And like I said, I usually do this kind of visually in this example. Okay, so I'm going to say okay, but watch what happens to my browser over here. I get a lot of pins. In fact, there should be 42 of them. There's 41 plus the original. Okay. Now think about this. We're going to do this over and over and over again. My browser is going to get crazy long and annoying. So here's a new tip. I'm going to right mouse click on my bodies folder and new group. Okay, and you can see that it kind of created a folder icon called group 1. So I'm going to call this, I'll just call it ring 1 or something like that. I can rename these. And then I can come in here, let me just shift select all of these guys. And I'm just going to drag and drop those into that folder. And notice it tells me there's 42 bodies inside that folder. If I expand it open, there they are. But if I fold it down, I don't have this huge long list. Okay. Okay. So this next part is kind of repetitive. I'm going to do a couple of these and then hopefully stay on time. So I want to reuse one of these pins and do it on the next path. So I'm going to come in here and say move. I'll click maybe on this original pin right here. I'm going to click on it. Now here's a tip. Before you move it, come down here and say create copy. And then I'm just going to drag this up in space somewhere. I don't care where. And you'll notice it left the original and it's created a copy. Okay. Now let me back up and show you why I'm highlighting this. I'm going to say move. I'm going to click on that guy, and I'm going to say, you know, I want to move it up like so. You'll notice create copy kind of grayed out. It's basically saying, oh, you want to move it, you don't need to copy it. Okay, so the trick there is to select it, say create a copy, and then you're going to tell it, I want to move that copy, is basically what you're saying here. Okay. Okay, so I do that, and this is pretty much exactly what we did. I'm going to say align. I'm going to align this body, and I'm going to zoom up a little bit so you can kind of see. Let me rotate underneath. And again, it's kind of black, so it's a little hard to see. But I'm going to hover over this edge, and you can kind of see it's catching to the center point of this cylindrical edge. Now, be careful because every edge has an end point and a start point, and you can see it kind of grabbed it right there. If I click that, it's not going to give me the result that I want. So take the time to make sure it's grabbing that center point there. I want that lined up with that axis there. You can kind of see it's lined up. I'll do my move command again. I'll just click on there and drag this guy down. I usually look underneath and try to match it to be fairly close to the other ones there, you know, so they're all about the same height or whatever. Okay, so I did that guy. Pattern on a path. What body? That body there. What's the path? And just like I said, pretty repetitive. I'm gonna grab these 4 paths. I like to start to drag to start to see the preview. And this next ring is 38, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, I'll drag this guy around like so. Sound effects are optional. And then you can change it from identical to path direction, and you'll see that they all splay out. Now, here's something a little interesting. Notice this pin is right on that point. And as I drag this, you'll see it kind of reorient a little bit as it rotates around and stuff like that. So I try to sometimes, and I might have to increase the quantity or something like that to not have a pin be like right on an edge or right on a point. So let's make this 39 in this case. And then I might just drag this closer because I want these spacing. There we go. So you can kind of see it's going to look a little bit nicer as it comes around the corner, for example. So I'll say okay, etc., etc. Okay. I'll do it one more time real quick. So here's all those pins. I'll create a new group. We'll call it ring 02. I'll shift select all of these and drag them into that group. So you can kind of see, it tells me the quantity and all that kind of stuff. Okay, move. I'm going to move the original one again. I could use this inside one. It really honestly doesn't matter in this case. I just kind of like to know, it's easier to see, it's easier to grab. So I'm going to grab that guy, align, making sure I get that correct edge, not that guy. Notice how it's on the edge. I want to make sure it's the center. I'll do that guy there. We'll move him in place. Let me drag it down just a little bit. I know I'm kind of rushing here. I don't want my wife to find out that I stole her hairbrush. Okay, so let's do pattern on a path. Same thing, that body, what's the path? And I do have to select all 4. Now I could just do, you know, right here, and that's as far as it's gonna go. So again, depending on what your path looks like will depend on how far these objects go. So let's do 30 in this case, like so. Change this to path direction. You kind of see how it splays out. And honestly, how quickly we're building, you know, this complex geometry, I think is pretty impressive. So let's just do ring 3. Oops. put those guys in there. Okay. Move, create copy. Align. I usually zoom up to make sure. And you can kind of see why we created these axes earlier. So I'm clicking on that axis. It's now perfectly lined up. And you'll notice that angle is different than the original angle. So I couldn't just use one axis and hope that it would work. So I kind of captured that information all the way along the path here. So let me do that guy, bring it down. And again, like I said, I could have gone, point to point to the surface or whatever. I just kind of was thinking, how is this thing actually manufactured? These are like pushed into this fabric and melted or something. I think if you took one apart, you would see that. Let's do the pattern on a path. And then I'll do the last line for you just to show you how, the path doesn't even have to be closed. It can be open. So let's do this path here. And I'll start to drag. I haven't been turning off suppress like I showed earlier, but that's okay. You don't have to. I just think it kind of speeds things up. So we'll drag around. Path direction. Okay. Now, sometimes you might get, I guess that is, they're kind of leaning in. Again, it depends on the quality of the path and all that kind of stuff. So you might get some different results. And to me, it seems like these are kind of leaning inside a little bit more than I wanted it to. And it could be because of how tight this path is on the corners. So I might instead, set this to maybe like 12 and do this in two separate paths. So you can kind of see, like I could do it on this side like so, doing the path direction, and then I could do it on this side also as a separate one, and that might get me a better result. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave that and then get to this last pin here. So let me do let's see, move this guy, copy, drag him out in space somewhere, doesn't matter where, but you do have to align. And I'll align it with this last axis right here. Move it into place. And you can see once you kind of get the process, it goes pretty quick. Again, think about how long this would take to do manually or whatever. And then create pattern on a path. What's the path? Let's say this line right here. You can kind of see as I'm dragging that along. I'll say path direction. You can kind of see how it's following that path direction. And I think in this case, it's pretty small. It's only like 8. And I'll go to the end right there, like so. Okay. So that's the basic idea. And again, I could do this other one, the other direction. I'm going to leave that for now because we're always running out of time. And I kind of wanted to show another cool command that we just added into, let me just do one more group here. I'll just say rest and put all of these guys in here. Okay. We just recently added in the surface this ruled surface. And what this allows you to do is I can pick on a profile like this guy here, okay? And then you'll notice I can specify a distance. And you can kind of see in this case, it's going like normal to this edge. And so it's kind of tucking in a little bit. I want to, and I can go tangent to that edge. See, so you can see if I pulled out that direction, it would basically extend the tangencies of that. Or I could say direction, and it's hard to see because it's kind of buried, but I'm going to click in the Z direction, and now it's taking that edge and basically allow me to extrude that edge as a ruled surface. So I'm going to go down 1/4 of an inch in this case. Okay, now, in fact, I'm going to turn off that sketch, simplify things. I want to put this surface on the other side. Well, I could say mirror, but I don't have, my origin is up on this level right here. So I'm going to say plane along a path. What's the path? I'll just click on this edge right here. And it's going to be hard to see because it's really tiny. But I'm going to start to drag, and you'll see it kind of snap proportionally halfway. That's what that is right there. I could have also said physical and typed in 0.125, right? Because this is 1/4 inch in thickness. But I'm going to say proportional, and it's actually going to basically snap automatically there. And I'll say OK. I'll turn my construction back on so you can see it, and I'll grab the corner there so we can make this a little bit bigger so you can kind of see what we did. So we just created a plane that's halfway through that line. Now if I were to say mirror, what do we want to mirror? Well, I want to mirror that guy. What's my mirror plane? That guy there. And watch what happens when I say OK. It took that surface and it mirrored it along that plane to the bottom side. But you'll notice I now have 1, 2, 3 separate surfaces. They're not actual bodies. But if I came in and said stitch, that guy, notice the edge turned green, and that guy, notice that edge turned green. Watch what happens over here when I say OK. I now have an actual body. So I'll say brush head. This is an actual body. I could section through it and all that kind of stuff. I could combine all of these pins into it. I could come in here. Let's just add a quick fillet all the way around. Let me just grab all 4 of these edges, and let's just do maybe like, I don't know, maybe 0.1 or something. I'm trying to think of, or 0.05 is what I tried earlier. Let me go 0.05. Yeah, so you can kind of see how it's going to fillet all the way around. So let me grab these other edges. You can see that I can even pick through. Okay. I'll say okay. And then finally, maybe we add an appearance, A for appearance. I'll use that black. I'm just going to drag it onto that body. And now you can kind of see we've got the head of the brush. All we'd have to do now is the handle, for example. So allowed me to reuse these existing surfaces. I just mirrored them straight down and combined them together basically into a solid body. Okay, so hopefully that gets the gears turning for where you could use pattern on a path. Like that's why I showed that lacrosse head, a hairbrush. Maybe you're designing like a toothbrush and it has like some features that go along the curvature of the toothbrush. You could use pattern on a path to add those features along a surface or along an edge, for example. So want to thank Angelo for helping out on the keyboard. Hopefully you found this beneficial. I think we're going to have Angelo do the live stream next week on a cam topic. So definitely keep an eye out for that next Thursday. And we'll see you then. Thank you.